Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, welcome. My name is Debbie from NDIS Property Australia and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights, guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. And I've got a guest speaker from the office with me today, Lenore. Hello, Lenore.
Hello. Hello, Debbie.
Nice to have you here, Lenore. We today are going to be speaking about a report that's just been released by the Summer Foundation and Housing Hub, the SDA Supply in Australia, released November 2023. Now, this is an annual report that they put out, which is a combination of the provider confidence, the SDA provider confidence in the market, as well as the SDA supply pipeline, which comes out of a survey that the Housing Hub do of, it's a voluntary survey of providers in Australia, so it doesn't cover all of the providers and therefore all of the pipeline, but it does include a significant proportion of the major providers, we believe, in Australia. And what is interesting about this report is that it gives us a bit of a different overview of upcoming potential supply of SDA in Australia that differs from a little bit from the NDIA's own pipeline data. So we thought we had a look through this 135-page report and thought that it was worth just going over some of the key findings in it. So Lenore, do you want to maybe introduce the first points there?
Yeah, it's a very interesting report. It gives a lot of granularity and a lot of very detailed information that we don't normally get from the NDIA. 60 SDA providers took part in the survey, and 55 of these provided details on their pipeline. And it's very interesting to see for instance, some of the results on provider approaches and confidence. It's interesting to see that the provider confidence seems to be increasing. Then there's also some information on the impact on the SDA pricing review on confidence and level of pipeline development.
And the pipeline development, that's broken down into a lot of detail, isn't it?
Yes. I found really interesting, the breakdown on how much time it takes between the different steps in the pipeline and which steps there are. Then there's also a national overview on maximum number of residents, location, building type, design category, and also on SDA development status. Yeah, then there's...
I think they break it down by state as well.
Yes, and also by SA4 regions.
Yeah. So I thought that we could just go through some of this information. Obviously, the provider confidence probably we'll just summarize a little bit of that because there's a few interesting things in there. But given that Lenore and I both love all of the data and the statistics here, we'll go into a little bit more detail of the findings in the supply pipeline. Now, I just want to note that Lenore said there was, I think, 60 providers that did contribute to this report. Whilst we know that there are a lot more SDA providers in Australia, the majority of registered SDA providers we know might only have one or two properties that they look after and are probably not developing a lot of new properties. So whilst this definitely doesn't capture all of the pipeline in development, I think we could safely say it's if not being a major percentage, it's certainly going to be a good indication of what's happening and where it's being built and what's being built and the timelines. So without further ado, we will jump straight into looking a little bit more detail at this report. And the first section of it was talking about the providers themselves who participated in this and things like resources they used, confidence that they have in the market, things like that. So what I think I found really interesting was that over the few years that this report has been done, which is now, this is the third year that they've listed this provider confidence, it has improved significantly. So we saw over the last couple of years the number of providers that were very unconfident or slightly unconfident or neither unconfident nor confident were kind of staying the same or increasing. We see a big jump now in providers that are slightly confident to very confident in the market, which is a really good sign. Now, I think that the main reason for this that's listed, or one of the main reasons for this, is the impact of the SDA price review. So I know that from our perspective in selling properties, up until June when the price review was released, things were very much stagnating. It was a lot harder to get investors interested because the returns were not reflecting the cost involved to build these properties. And there wasn't a lot of options to get good properties built that cost more that would also return the good yields that they're after for this riskier than normal investment type. Now, as we know, the pricing review kind of shook everything up. On the whole, it was very positive, and the incomes on the whole were raised very, very significantly. And we've seen that from our perspective, created a huge lot of new interest in people wanting to develop SDA, build SDA and invest in SDA. So obviously that is very much reflected here in the confidence levels on providers across the board. So that's pretty much all I really wanted to touch on with the provider confidence. That leads us straight into the actual SDA supply pipeline. And I'm going to hand over to Lenore to talk a bit more about some of these aspects. But just to lead into it, I mentioned before that this compares to the NDIA pipeline data, or rather it doesn't get to it, because the NDIA pipeline data is based on information provided to the NDIA when the plans for SDA properties are assessed compliant and submitted to the NDIA prior to construction. And this normally happens only a short while before construction. So that is the information that the NDIA are putting out. What they know has got compliant plans ready to go and the construction's close to starting. Now, the providers that submitted their responses to the survey here for Housing Hub, they were able to provide pipeline information on properties that are much further in the future. So those that were still in the planning stage that hadn't necessarily actually reached the stage of having compliant plans submitted to the NDIA. So the information does look quite different to what the NDIA put out, but it is giving us a much more, I think, valuable overview of longer-term pipeline and what providers and developers are looking to be putting into the supply chain for SDA. So the overall pipeline year by year, so they've obviously been doing the survey of the pipeline data since 2018, because back in 2018, the Housing Hub survey said there were 1,518 properties in the pipeline. Now, this year, we have 2,287, which has actually gone down very slightly over the last 2 years. It peaked in 2021, 2,306, and August 2022 was 2304. 2366 in August 2021. So we're down to 2287, just below 2,300, but significantly more than the first 3 years of the survey. So again, that is, I guess, telling us that confidence is there, that providers are happy to still continue to put plans in place for developing SDA, and we all know we need it. So the next interesting thing I thought was, and I'm not going to go in depth into the state-by-state information, but I think just the Australia-wide info is interesting. The maximum number of residents in the pipeline I thought was quite cool to look at. And what we're talking about here is a graph that shows us the number of dwellings and places for one tenant, for two, for 3, 4 and 5 tenants. Lenore, do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, there seems to be a large number of development in places for a maximum of one participant, and particular for high physical support requirements. Yeah.
What about the numbers for the 4 and 5 participant requirements?
Yes, these are falling, and they're not very popular amongst providers as well as participants. So it's fewer and fewer of these dwellings are being planned and built.
And rightly so, because obviously
Exactly.
they're not popular. We know that the current group homes, even if they're the new build, meet current SDA guidelines, they're rarely fully tenanted, if at all, because participants with choice and control, even if they have group home funding, are more likely to try and move into a home that has less sharing participants. So, yeah, and the NDIA in their price review back in June, it was also a recommendation put forward that group homes be phased out in the future. So, yeah, that's interesting. The next thing I highlighted that we should look at was a comparison of SDA places in development over time. And this is actually a graph that shows the number of places year by year in each state. And what I'm looking at here is that New South Wales was always had the highest number of places in development. So obviously when we talk about in development, we're talking about the Housing Hub survey. And that changed last year in 2022. For the first time, Victoria and Queensland overtook New South Wales. And this year, WA has jumped up and is now just coming behind Victoria and Queensland. Actually, they've got more. They've overtaken Victoria and Queensland in the number of places in the pipeline, which is very interesting. So we still have this particular year, Victoria and Queensland have dropped below New South Wales again. But it's very interesting that Perth has leapt up so much. The last 2 years has seen a relatively significant increase in South Australia in the pipeline, and the other smaller states have only had very minor changes over time. So, yeah, what's jumping out to me there is Western Australia. So we know that Western Australia was the last state to implement the SDA scheme, and I guess they're playing catch up. So the next graphs were the estimated number of SDA places across the build type. So we've got the 2,286 places. The majority are apartments, closely followed by houses. So the rough numbers we're looking at are about probably 800 apartments, about 750 houses, and this is places I'm talking about a bit over 500 villa duplex townhouses, and just a small number, maybe about 120 in group homes. So I guess it's worth remembering that even though the price review came out in June with the new prices that actually had a decrease in funding for high physical support apartments, a lot of this pipeline construction was probably already in place. So I would imagine that we will maybe see these particular figures change quite drastically next year. That'd be my guess, as people see that there might be an oversupply in apartments and high physical support, and we might see a lot of other developments. So that leads on to the estimated number of SDA places across the design category. And Lenore, do you want to talk to that one?
Yes, so this is, design category. And what sticks out very clearly is the high level of high physical support designs, which is just multiples of the other categories being. The second one is robust. The third one, it's very interesting. And then also improved livability is close to robust. Then fully accessible and multi-design categories are there as well. But
Just a handful.
just a handful.
Yeah. But when you see that graph, it's just got this huge bar for high physical support and very little of anything else.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So, look, we've discussed this many times before. We know that having high physical support properties as the majority of supply is not necessarily a bad thing, because 90% roughly of SDA participants can live in high physical support. And now that the new funding levels have kind of evened the field a bit more, that's even less of an issue now. But I think we still have a huge place for properties built to improve livability and fully accessible specific designs to be put into development as well. So the next graph is and this is, I think, one for Lenore to talk about, because I know she found this very interesting. Estimated number of SDA places by development status. So do you want to tell us more about that?
Yes.
Lenore?
So, I found it really interesting to see what the development statuses are. So the first status is land secured and waiting for building approval and finance approval. And a lot of places are at this stage. Then the next stage is development and building approval is completed and contractually committed to build. And that's about half as much. So I guess that also indicates how quickly these processes are. So the faster you can go through a process, the fewer, wouldn't you say?
Well, a lot of the timeline in this is very much dependent upon where you're building and the land that you're building on. We know a lot of supply is being built in new estates, and obviously nothing can happen until the land is actually registered and titled. So whilst it may be in the planning stage, could it even be contractually committed to some degree, the land is still not been officially purchased because it's still to be titled. So there can be many months of delay there when we've got that sort of aspect coming into it.
And then the majority of places are under construction. So again, I think that's because it takes a long time to construct a building. And then construction is completed and pending enrollment with the NDIA, and that's low number. And then the development is stalled. There are also a few that have development stalled. So
I guess the first two categories you mentioned are probably the pipeline data that the Housing Hub have that is not being reported by the NDIA, because once it's under construction, those plans will have been submitted to the NDIA. So probably talking about roughly 50% are under construction or beyond that, and the rest are still.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. That was sort of the overall Australia-wide data. And I wanted to look just briefly at each state to look at where the places are in the pipeline and compare them to the enrolled numbers of places. So I've got each of the graphs here for each of the states, and it's broken down into the SA4 regions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, we do use that a lot. It's the statistical area for it. It's a region of the country that has a population anywhere of between 100 to 500,000 people. As an example, there are 2 SA4 regions in the Northern Territory. There are 7 in Western Australia, 4 in Tasmania, 7 in South Australia. In New South Wales, we have, about 25 SA4 regions. So that basically is what it means. Like in Sydney, we might have about 9 different SA4 regions. So it's very broad data. But I just thought it was interesting to look at some of these parts of Sydney, for example, in the New South Wales data that has a significant amount of enrolled SDA places and also quite a bit of pipeline places. Areas like Sydney Parramatta, Sydney Outer West, Newcastle and Lake Macquarie, Central Coast, the Mid-North Coast. But when we look at pretty much all the other areas, we've got, some enrolled places, but we've got a much smaller number of pipeline. And if we look at the Sydney market, and we've been discussing this recently on some other episodes, places like Sydney, city and inner south, eastern suburbs, inner southwest, inner west, North Sydney and Hornsby, northern beaches and outer southwest, almost no pipeline or very little pipeline. So, and we know that across most of these areas there is, a relative amount of demand. And interesting, and we haven't quite done that fully yet, Lenore, have we, to compare the NDIA pipeline data and the Housing Hub pipeline data. But I'd imagine it's going to probably reflect similar trends for want of any more detailed information that is going to give us more actual data. So, yeah, this is very much about the trends. In Victoria, again, the areas that have got quite a lot of enrolled but also a fair amount of pipeline is the Melbourne Northeast and the Melbourne West, which very much fits with what we know is going on the ground there. We know there's a lot of development in north and western parts of Melbourne. And the areas one area is sticking out to me here is the Melbourne Outer East, which has the 3rd highest number of enrolled places and virtually no pipeline. So not sure why that's looking like that. It might be that the demand is already oversupplied, or people are realising there's no reason to build more there, or it might just be that it's been too expensive in that area to get the correct kind of land, suitable land. So there's a lot to take out of this, I think. Just very quickly looking at the other states, Queensland, Townsville is interesting, and we know that Townsville has had a lot of development in the last few years. It has the greatest number of pipeline compared to the current enrolled. Logan comes next after that. And interestingly, there's quite a bit of pipeline in the Brisbane East, North and South regions. So, yeah, some really interesting information to come out of there. South Australia, we are seeing the majority of enrolled places are in Adelaide North, and that's also where the most pipeline is, but it's only a significant, a small extra, not a significant amount of extra pipeline. South Australia, we've just gone through South Australia. Tasmania is only really some pipeline happening in tiny bit in Hobart and a little bit more actually in the west and northwest of Tasmania, which is quite interesting. And it's also interesting to note that the enrolled places in Tasmania are predominantly in Launceston in the northeast and the west and northwest, and there's less enrolled places in Hobart. However, Tasmania is its own kind of beast because they have something called in-kind dwellings, which state-run disability housing that have been kind of brought into the SDA Supply. Very interesting to note in the most recent data that just came out from the NDIA that has not obviously been taken into account with the information here from Housing Hub, because this report was obviously produced just before the new stats came out from the NDIA. They're no longer reporting on in-kind in Tasmania. So, but anyway, it's still here in this one, and it's just showing that there's very little going on at the moment in Tasmania. We know that there's probably a little bit more happening that this is showing. So again, it's all of this has to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt, because we know that not all of the providers and developers doing SDA were reflected in this survey. The last two states, the ACT, a small number of pipeline dwellings compared to the enrolled, and the Northern Territory. Interesting, we've got a little bit of pipeline in Darwin. The other region in the Northern Territory is the Outback, and that has got probably, I would say, looking at this graph, about 60% enrolled and about 40% in the pipeline of their estimated places. So there's obviously it's a small number, but I think we're looking at about 5 total places in that part of the Northern Territory. But interesting that nearly half of them are in the pipeline. So that is the kind of results that I got out of this whole survey, this 135-page report. Lenore, did you want to, I know you sort of looked at it with a different eye to me, so I thought you might want to just add your 2 cents worth.
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting report. I think it's really worthwhile having a look at this if you are interested in investing in SDA, definitely. I had a look at the key findings, which I thought were very interesting. We have already touched on the large proportion of development in high physical support, in single accommodation, the increase in Western Australia and SDA. Yeah. Also, what I found interesting, which was pointed out in this report, is the separation of housing and support services, which has become a lot more, which is a model which is encouraged by the NDA and has continued to improve each year. And that certainly gives participants an increased freedom of choice over housing and support services.
You know why I think that's actually happened is obviously, yes, the NDIA kind of frown upon the same provider offering both SDA and SIL, and it's encouraged that those two aspects should be well and truly separated, even if it's by the same business, very much running them as two different. But I think when the SDA rollout first happened, a lot of the SIL providers sort of automatically got SDA registration because there was no one else doing it and someone had to be able to manage the properties. So it was sort of just an automatic thing that these SIL providers got SDA. And this is still a bit of a hangover from that. So it's interesting that this is now being reflected, I guess, in the provider confidence and the provider information coming out, that there is seen to be, it's better for most people that that separation is there.
Yeah. Also, what I found interesting, that by building type, most places were apartments and houses and like 1 or 2 or 3 resident dwellings, which I think is very positive.
Yeah, well, yeah, we've certainly seen that drop in group homes. And I think, I think that this report is still very much reflecting development that would have started a year or 2 ago and earlier this year. So it's not so reflective of the changes in the SDA world since the price review, and we know that it has changed these things substantially. So it'll be really interesting to see the difference that's reflected when they do this report again next year.
Yes, that could be very interesting.
Yeah, and hopefully the main aim of that price review was to accurately reflect the cost of development, but also and we've discussed this many times, so I won't go into much detail, but we know that the original prices that were so highly skewed towards single tenancy, high physical support apartments encouraged everybody to build single tenancy, high physical support apartments, and the tenants for those properties just don't exist. So by levelling the field with bringing the lower funded levels up much higher and reducing some of those other things has changed everything in terms of what is going to encourage ongoing development. So, and this report is a really good reflection of what's going on in that part of the industry. So yeah, stay tuned for this same report in 12 months' time. Very interesting. So any last thoughts, Lenore? Have we covered everything?
No thoughts.
Okay, all right. Well, look, we're going to have a copy of this report or the link to download this report for you in the description of the episode. So, and if anyone has any more questions about supply and demand, you can get in touch with us here. You can email info@ndis.property or call our phone number 1300 254 397. And we'd be more than happy to discuss anything to do with supply and demand of SDA around Australia. So that wraps up this episode, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.